All right. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Engineering Major Philosophy Minor. This is the channel where you guys can get an engineer's perspective on topics pertaining to engineering, philosophy, politics, and various other social issues. Very important announcement. Someone commented on my previous video saying that the 6-year-old boy, whose name I have now learned is Harper, found the video of watching a couple trains, and he I think has probably watched it a few times. It's kind of funny that that video actually has like more views than any other video on this channel, but no worries. So that has actually inspired me. I probably want to do a couple more, or well, start a channel dedicated to train spotting, because in this area there's a lot of good opportunities for that. So I'll see if I can get around to that, and that way Harper and maybe his other friends who are into trains and other people obviously can go watch train spotting videos, and it will all be made for kids. No, grown up political talk. And yeah, so maybe that'll be a separate channel coming up here. But in this video, so I have a lot of ideas for videos that I want to do. And I did get a comment separate from the train on my previous video. Now, I don't want to make a habit of this, responding directly to certain comments on YouTube, but this person wrote a pretty extensive response, which seemed like a good example of, an attempt at refuting some of the things I said in my previous video. And so I want to take an opportunity to kind of respond to this comment. So this comment was pointing out the fact that I, made my kind of joking remark, which I say in the video. It's it's halfway a joke, halfway serious, that I fled communism when I left California. So let's go ahead and take a look at his comment here. So I put his comment up here in the upper left here, and I wanted to break it down kind of line by line. So I know this is too small to see, but it's copy pasted here, and we've got a couple slides to go through here. So first off, he starts off with California is not communism. I understand that California isn't really communism. Again, this remark that I made was halfway joking, halfway serious. And in a second, I will get into more detail as to why, what the serious part of that is. But in general, it's kind of a joke. Somebody says, "Why did you leave California?" I say, "Oh, I was fleeing communism." Ha ha. We have a little joke at the water cooler and move on. So, okay, yeah, I mean, I agree with him. It's not communism. But then he goes on, caring about your neighbors, wanting a community with decent healthcare and education isn't communism. I don't really know why he gets the impression that I don't want to live in a community that has decent healthcare or decent education. Obviously, what does signify communism, though, and maybe we need to look at some definitions here in a second, but I want to get through some of this before we do. The thing about communism is the idea is that, healthcare and education would be owned by the community or whatever, and people would, draw from it according to their needs or whatever. The problem is what inevitably ends up happening is, and especially if you take, the kind of like Marxist definition of what he thought communism would be, there's a violent overthrow and somebody is left, to fill up the power vacuum. And what ends up happening is that, the government just dictates what is quote unquote decent healthcare and what is good education for the community. And that's really the problem that I have with this statement right here, because it's very easy to say, well, yeah, I want decent healthcare, right? But what does decent actually mean? Who defines what decent is? My belief, the conservative belief, is that the individual basically utilizes the prices and services available in the free market to purchase, to work for and purchase exactly what they need for them personally, rather than the community owning it and them deciding what is decent for you or decent for me. Okay, let's go on. Believing people deserve a decent living wage. So again, here we have this problem, here we have two kind of adjectives right here, decent and living. Well, what do you define? Somebody has to define what is decent and what is living. Now, I'm of the belief that you, as a man, are going to figure out what your needs are, and you are going to determine what wage you need to make in order to accommodate for those needs. And then you are going to go get a job or pursue a career or put in the effort in order to generate that level of wealth and wage in order to live your life. So that's what America provides, right? Like that's liberty right there. That's freedom. Now, we'll look at here in a second what happens when the government gets involved. So he says, deserve a decent living wage. So here, the other word in here that catches me is this word deserve. The reason why I don't really like the word deserve is because it's my personal belief that nobody really deserves anything. You just earn what you get. I live in a nice place. I have a nice job. I don't necessarily deserve that job. I earned it, somebody, I don't have the right to just have that given to me from somebody simply by existing. Like America used to have before the rich got rich and big businesses got, he says subsided here, but I think he means subsidized. And workers were told they can't afford to pay them more. But when they get huge tax cuts, big business buys back its stock, hands out bonuses to executives, and workers get nothing. Isn't communism? First off, there have always been in human history people who are quote unquote rich or who have let's say a higher socioeconomic status than other people. The difference with communism is that the government ends up dictating who those people are that become rich. In a capitalist society like we have in America, for the most part, you are in charge of whether or not you become rich to the extent that that's possible, right? I mean, obviously, certain people are born with certain advantages. Other people have certain disadvantages, but there are plenty of stories of people rising up from the most disadvantageous situations. In fact, I know some people who I love and are very dear to me who have possibly some of the least advantageous situations growing up, and they now live in some of the best places to live in the United States. They're not billionaires, but the lifestyle that they lead is not that of extreme poverty. So here's one thing, though, that I actually agree with, which is I don't agree with big business subsidies. In fact, if you read Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, he describes a couple situations where when the government came in and intervened with private competition, essentially like capitalist competition, the government actually created a monopoly. Now, if you watch the Locals video where I talk about this Noam Chomsky interview, at another point in that interview, Noam Chomsky talks about how when the free market is just allowed to, go by itself on its own, it creates monopolies. But if you read this chapter in Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, you actually know that with the railroad industry, it was actually the complete opposite. So when, the railroad industry was booming, people were laying down track everywhere. You could have trains that went from anywhere to anywhere. And what happened was one of the bigger railroad companies at the time got upset and had the government basically subsidize that company and also regulate other companies so that they could get a, certain market share of a certain area. And it was really government-empowered subsidization that allowed the formation of a monopoly, and that's exactly why there are way fewer trains than there probably otherwise would have been. And a similar thing happened with oil pipelines, actually, as well. So I'm in agreement here. I don't think that big business should get subsidized by government at all. But then to go on and say, well, it's wrong for big business to buy back its stock and it's bad when they get tax cuts and, they hand out bonuses to executives and workers get nothing. Well, in my personal anecdotal experience, but this is the anecdotal experience shared by the thousands of other engineers that I work with. I mean, we all get bonuses when the company does well, and this is true for now at this point, the 3 different engineering firms that I've worked for. This is true also not just of hardware engineering firms that I work for, but also software engineering firms. I mean, most big companies, pay bonuses to their employees. this is with exception to, I think, things like for example, if you're in the food industry, I'm not super sure about that. I know I used to work in the food industry, I used to work at Whole Foods a really long time ago. I don't know that we got a bonus, although I don't think I worked there for long enough to get this bonus, but um, we did get, a significant discount on groceries. Like I think at the time it was a 30% discount. So, to basically say that workers get absolutely nothing in terms of bonuses, it's just not true. To the person who wrote this comment, hey, look, I'm sorry if your company doesn't get bonuses, but that's the beauty of the free market is there's thousands of other companies, and I'm sure your skill set is going to be viable at any of these other companies. So, you might take a bonus just by moving out of California and then working for one of these other companies that actually does provide bonuses. And then, workers get nothing. This isn't slave labor that we're talking about, right? You know, you get an offer letter. It has a certain wage. You can negotiate that offer letter. I've negotiated offer letters. I've negotiated on wage. I've negotiated on vacation. The onus is on you, again, to determine what is a living and decent wage for you and then take steps in your own life to do it. So, the problem I have with this is not that I completely disagree. It's just that, this is one thing that's very a commonly held thing that's working in the background of a lot of these communist and socialist beliefs is they take, individual responsibility and personal accountability completely out of the equation. He's saying a lot of stuff, this isn't communism, that isn't communism. And again, I understand that, but let's just go ahead and look at what the definition of communism is, and let's make a couple comparisons. So we have, just Googling communism directly, a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Okay, so advocating class war is certainly an important part of this, like I talked earlier. Also, I highly recommend reading Thomas Sowell's book on Karl Marx. The entire book, basically, with the exception of the last chapter, is actually just talking about Marx's life and his theories and things like that. And there's no criticism or commentary at all. It's literally just, it's like you're reading an encyclopedia about Marx. It's really good. But this whole idea of advocating for class war. This is a huge issue that I have with Marxist philosophy in general. But I kind of want to be generous to this person who left the comment, and we'll just eliminate that premise that there needs to be a class war, and we'll just go with this kind of textbook definition: a system in which goods are owned in common and are available to all as needed. So when you look at this definition of communism, I think that there's actually a lot of interesting comparisons that we can make between, California and the USSR, and that's kind of what I've done here. So here's the definition that you want to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and just look at some comparisons between California and the USSR. We'll take healthcare and education first because he says decent healthcare and education right here. Then he talks about wages. And then actually eventually he's going to talk about religion. And then he'll say the USSR and China were not and are not pure communism. So my opinion on this statement, and the reason why I want to talk about this is because we're about to do these comparisons. The reason why I want to say this is not pure communism is that we don't have any examples of what pure communism is other than the USSR, China, Venezuela, Cambodia, South Korea before the Korean War, North Korea. These countries are the only countries we have of examples of where communism was implemented. And so, to say that they're not pure communism, I don't think is necessarily fair because, you can say it's not pure communism in like the kind of theoretical sense that it's all hunky-dory when there's no private property and, everybody just, I guess, commonly votes on who gets what and stuff like that. And people only take according to their needs, but, who determines what that need is, ends up being up to the government. In the practical sense, I would argue that the USSR and China are pure communism. simply because, and of course all these countries that I listed, simply because the same thing repeats itself in every single one of these, has repeated itself in every single one of these countries. So let's do some comparisons here. And again, I say California is like a communist country. I say that somewhat flippantly, right? The government doesn't literally dictate everything. There obviously still is private property, right? You can own a home. I had a debate with my cousin actually about this because her opinion is that if you have to pay taxes, you don't technically own it. But I think that maybe there's anyway that's a topic for another day. Let's do some comparisons here. So healthcare. So there is a dictated public option in addition to the dictated federal option, which is Obamacare, I believe, or the Affordable Care Act, for which the taxpayer is financially responsible. So this seems to me that it's a system in which the good, that being healthcare, is really owned in common, except that, as you can see, it's only the taxpayer who pays for it, and then the common gets to take as needed. In the USSR, we had a fully public system, completely dictated. And, of course, I'm going through the Gulag Archipelago. There's a lot of really interesting things about how the, doctors in the USSR had to operate in the internment camps. And it's very interesting there because when we talk about are available to all as needed, the problem is that these doctors had an incentive not to treat certain people or to essentially lie about health conditions, basically in order to avoid public scrutiny. And so, healthcare was not available to all as needed. It was only available to, the communist elites. The thing about here in America is, if you go to the emergency room in California, you'll find that there's a ton of homeless people in there, right? These people can't pay. In fact, a lot of them will come in there just because they want to spend the night there. Now, the taxpayer, despite also paying for the public option, paying for their own health care, and paying for the federal public option, so the state and federal public option, they also need to go into the emergency room and find that resources are taken up by homeless people. But the bottom line is the homeless people get treated, So we'll talk about that more in a second. Keep that in mind. So education and values. We have a public education system here in America for which the taxpayer is financially responsible. And this is, regardless of whether or not you choose to do homeschool or private school. So, you're paying twice. That's definitely a good which is owned in common. Now, in California, they have adopted certain curriculums that, in my opinion, are anti-American, they're anti-capitalism, and they're pro-government command-style economy and very pro-big government values. And in the USSR, they had the Komsomol. This was a fully public and government-dictated education system. And they also had a curriculum of anti-American, anti-capitalism, and pro-government command-style economy values. In fact, you had a situation where, children as low as age 6 could be, liable for political punishment. This is what was taught in the Komsomol. Here in California, they've adopted systems like critical race theory. So let's talk about wages. California dictates, a minimum wage. It has one of the highest minimum wages in the country. There's also a federal minimum wage. California has the largest poor population in the U.S. In the USSR, wages were dictated, and there was a, incredibly large amount of forced labor and internment people. And this maybe isn't right, poor, forced to labor. What I really meant to say here is that these people were forced into an internment. They were, taken out of their non-private property homes, and they were put in these labor camps. And the conditions of these labor camps were, probably worse than a lot of poor people in California actually experience today, because, at least in California, you can beg for a couple dollars and get a candy bar, right? But in the USSR, or you could get a protein bar if you need a lot of calories. In the USSR, you got your ration of 8 ounces of bread, which is like a slice of bread, and what they call gruel, which I don't know what gruel actually is, but from what I understand from the book, it just seems like this nasty, watery, sloppy soup that's often dirty. Anyway, let's go on to energy production. California dictates energy production, essentially. They dictate the sources, the amounts, the prices. This is why gas is so expensive in California. This is why California has rolling blackouts. This is why California's power companies struggle to update their infrastructure. This is why a giant solar farm was built out in the middle of nowhere that produces a fifth of the power that a much smaller and more efficient nuclear reactor, non-emission nuclear reactor produces in the area. And of course in the USSR dictated energy production. So as we go through this, right, there's not a ton of differences. Religion, California is predominantly socially atheist. I mean, there are a ton of religious people in California, but it's definitely not the dominant social philosophy. In 2020 we had punishment of religious practice. You could not gather. In certain cases you would be arrested if you gathered, or fined significantly. In the USSR, socially atheist, punishment of religious practice. There's a chapter in the Gulag Archipelago where they talk about how members of the secret police, before they went into some bathhouse or whatever, would, just take their weapons and shoot at, statues or what they call icons. Goods production. In 2020, California had some of the strictest lockdown measures ever. They also have some of the most intensive regulations on businesses, dictating business operations like hours, what's essential, what's non-essential, what amenities are offered. You must wear a mask, or you must offer people a mask, or you must provide hand sanitizer everywhere around the gym, or you must make people this, you have to limit capacity, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. They dictated all this. This is the exact same in the USSR. And this is why you had these giant, grocery lines in the USSR. Justice system. Normal criminality, theft, rioting, payment delinquency is unpunished. Punishment for socially dangerous or politically incorrect behavior. This goes back to whether or not you wanted to engage in religious practices. This has to do with if you wanted to open your business, if you had people in your business when they weren't supposed to, if you didn't have outdoor seating, whatever. In the USSR, normal criminals were actually put in charge of the labor camps. And the reason why they did this in the USSR was because they said, well, the normal criminals are only criminals because they're products of, the bourgeoisie capitalist system, and therefore they need some kind of retribution. So we're going to put them in charge of the labor camps. So I ran through this table, and again, I want to emphasize the fact that, California and the United States in general, isn't obviously isn't the same as the USSR and isn't the same as China. We still have our constitutional rights, at least a little bit. Free speech, freedom to keep and bear arms, freedom of association. There is, still completely freedom of religion. Although, this person wanted to, leave an aggressive comment. So I just want to offer up some kind of evidence to support why, I make that flippant statement that I was fleeing communism from California. And also, again, we need to emphasize the fact that it's a flippant statement, right? Like it's meant to be half joking. It's meant to be half serious. But by the way, to this person who left this comment, you're welcome to keep living in California. I just didn't want to keep living in California for these reasons. I'm not really sure. I guess maybe this person's just trying to inform me of things. So, fair enough. So we left off at, well, let's read this. It is very similar to what Jesus taught, though. When the community is fed, healthy, and educated, the entire community benefits, not just the wealthy. I'm going to assume that this guy's an expert on what Jesus taught, and he knows more than me, so I won't comment on that. But when he says the community is fed, healthy, and educated, the entire community benefits, not just the wealthy. Well, I completely agree with that. The only difference between you and I is that I don't want to dictate what, exactly how the community needs to behave in order to be well-fed, healthy, and educated. The USSR and China were not and are not pure communism. I addressed that. The United States does not have pure capitalism either. That's completely true. I talked about this again with big business subsidies. I don't think big businesses should get subsidized. I think they should just fail if they're going to fail, and new ones will come and take their place. But here he says, unfortunately, because of conservatives, the U.S. is becoming more and more like an oligarchy and a corporatocracy. If conservatives had their way, we would also have a bit of theocracy. And with their policies, views on the poor, wages, healthcare, women, voting rights, and immigration, we would also be a fascist state where certain groups are marginalized and outright discriminated against. And there would be great poverty and people dying from treatable illnesses, corruption, and dangerous police force. The wealthy would be considered righteous and the poor would be considered lazy, freeloaders, and bad. So this is a super loaded statement right here, and I just think that this is not a good faith interpretation of what conservative values are. I want to address the fact that he thinks it's because of conservatives that the U.S. is becoming more and more like an oligarchy and a corporatocracy. I mean, I tend to completely I agree with that in one sense and disagree with it in another. My agreement is I think that it's true that a lot of Republicans in government, like a lot of establishment Republicans, definitely went along with certain agendas, particularly pertaining to China and free trade and stuff like that, that didn't work out in our favor. But didn't work out in terms of the average hardworking, like blue collar working individual. If the U.S. really, so Milton Friedman talks about this in Free to Choose as well. He talks about how free trade is actually a good thing. I tend to agree, but there's one thing that Milton Friedman kind of glosses over, which is that if the government in your own country that's advocating for free trade is also advocating for all these other like big government command style regulations and wages and stuff like that, you might be underestimating how competitive the labor force is actually in another country. So I actually think that the correct conservative position at the time when certain things like free trade and globalization were coming about, the correct conservative position should have been, we advocate for this, but then what we want to do is we want to eliminate things that are making it hard for businesses to do business in the U.S., and we actually want the U.S. labor market to be adequately competitive with some of these other countries. Now, what probably would have happened is that labor would have been outsourced anyway for a certain amount, but probably not as much. And the other thing is now, for example, in China, there's a lot of talk that Chinese wages are increasing to almost be on par with some of the wages that we have for the same work in the U.S. But I believe that if we eliminated the minimum wage and we got rid of like a bunch of excessive regulations and also decreased a ton of basically just got rid of a bunch of like regulatory agencies in the federal government and maybe even certain state governments, it would actually be more attractive for companies to come relocate back to the U.S. And this also has to do with when this guy says, well, they get huge tax cuts and that's a bad thing. Well, part of the reason why the economy was booming under President Trump is because he gave businesses those tax cuts and they hired people and they also invested in research and development and things like that. This entire block right here, though, that we'd end up in a fascist state if conservatives had their way. I think that that's just such a bad faith interpretation of what conservatives believe. He says, there would be a bit of theocracy. Well, what you should really do, to this person who left this comment, you should read Ben Shapiro's The Right Side of History. I'm listening to Michelle Obama's book right now, audiobook, and I disagree with her. I'm listening to it. So you can step up and you can get introduced to some more conservative views. But what you'll find in Ben Shapiro's book is he talks about how all of Western civilization was basically built on theocracy from, Aristotle and various other Judeo-Christian values. That's the whole premise of the book. For him to say that we would also have a bit of theocracy as if theocracy isn't undergirding basically the entire premise of Western civilization, that like all men are created equal, and that we have a constitution that has certain inalienable rights given to us by God, given to us by our Creator, that aren't granted by government. Like that entire philosophy is like a form of theocracy. I mean, honestly, if you look at what's happening on the radical left right now, they're the ones who are really advocating for a fascist state where certain groups are marginalized, and that certain group is conservative. There's a risk that if I talk about certain topics, that, you know, YouTube could basically ban me. I could have gotten banned on Twitter. There has been a lot of violence in the streets, directed towards conservatives. There is, there have been talks on big media platforms about how conservatives should be put into re-education camps. There is this interpretation that all conservatives are racist and bigoted, and, you know, we're just selfish and we don't care about anybody. I think it's actually the opposite is really true about conservatives. And, you know, where I see groups getting marginalized right now was in places like California, where they were marginalizing religious people and allowing certain political groups to violate government mandates while punishing other groups. And so I don't know. I mean, my experience is just that it's my belief, not just experience, is that it's completely the opposite. And then of course there would be great poverty and people dying for treatable illnesses. Well, if you look at, you know, every single communist country that's ever existed, it's actually that's exactly what happens in those countries at a far higher rate than does here in the U.S. The wealthy would be considered righteous and the poor would be considered lazy, freeloaders, bad. So he says the poor would be considered lazy, freeloaders. I mean, I'd be willing to bet this person also considers being poor bad. I mean, you know, how many times have you gone down to Skid Row and just like hung out with people down there who are just like shooting up on the streets and defecating and urinating like all over the street? Being poor is not a good thing. That doesn't mean that poor people are bad people, as in like they're awful people. It just means that you don't want to be poor, right? Like nobody wants to be poor. So, you know, and you don't want to be a freeloader either, right? Like these are things that are just generally bad things to be. And, you know, I don't consider the wealthy righteous. It's just that I consider the wealthy to be hardworking. To look at wealthy people, especially those who have built businesses and, you know, grown things from the ground up and come up with ideas that have, come up with treatments to illnesses, come up with ways to make the poor's standard of living a lot better by, you know, reducing the cost of goods. Those are traits that you certainly want to emulate. I don't know why this person thinks that it's conservative philosophy that produces all these things. It's, it actually ends up being radical left policy that produces all these bad things. And if you want evidence of that, just look at Democrat cities, and their economies and their level of homelessness and unemployment versus, conservative cities that just took a different approach in the pandemic. All right, guys, so I went through that comment in a lot of detail, and again, I don't want to make a habit out of this, but I do want to say before I conclude the video, thank you to this user who left this comment. This was a detailed comment, and there was a lot of material here to respond to, so I do appreciate that. And I appreciate it not just because I'm getting interaction on the platform, but I also appreciate it because, it helps me stay on top of my game, helps me make sure that I know what I'm talking about. It allows me to kind of utilize some of the knowledge I've gained from reading a lot of these books over the past, my life. And I really do encourage you to read some of the books that you might disagree with. To really understand the perspective that I'm coming from. And, Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, amazing book. Thomas Sowell, his book about Marx, which I think is just called Karl Marx or something like that with some subtitle. Ben Shapiro's Right Side of History, another really good read. And then, read the Gulag Archipelago because, again, there's a lot of insight in the Gulag Archipelago as to how practically communism actually plays out. And practicality of things is important for everyone to consider. And me being an engineer, it's especially important for engineers to consider because we deal with problems where, impracticality can make or break an entire program. It leads to a lot of contentious debates. But in the end, if we address practicality, we usually end up with better designs and better results for the customer, So I hope that this person who left this comment doesn't think that I'm just trying to completely attack them or tear them apart. It's really just me responding to the comment. And hey, if you keep disagreeing, leave another comment. I can't guarantee I'm going to make, a 40, 50-minute video responding to it. But, thanks for the view and thanks for the comment. And I will catch you guys in the next video. We'll probably be talking about John Cena. All right. Later, guys.